The House in the Hollow. Deep in the heart of the dense, forgotten woods of Black Hollow, a small, decaying house sat in eerie silence, abandoned for decades. Its windows, long covered in grime and dust, stared out like hollow eyes, and the once-painted walls had faded to a sickly gray under years of neglect. Vines had crept up the sides, twisting around the structure like they were trying to drag it back into the earth. The roof sagged under the weight of time, and the front door creaked on its hinges, hanging loosely as if waiting for someone to enter. Locals in the nearby town of Ashford spoke little about the house, but when they did, it was always in hushed tones, as if speaking its name aloud would summon the evil that was said to haunt it. The house had once belonged to a family, a mother, father, and their young daughter, but they vanished without a trace one stormy night. The authorities had searched high and low, but no sign of the family was ever found. The house, however, remained untouched by time, as if it were holding onto the memories of those who had lived there. Over the years, there were rumors, whispers in the wind about the house being cursed. They said that every night, when the moon hung high in the sky, you could hear strange noises coming from within its walls. Sometimes, it was the sound of crying, soft and pitiful, like the mournful sobs of a child. Other times, it was the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate steps that seemed to echo through the dark forest, as though someone was walking around the house, but no one could be seen. No one dared to venture near the house. It had become an unspoken rule among the people of Ashford. But one fateful evening, a young man named Adam, newly arrived in the town, found himself drawn to the house. He had recently moved to Ashford, looking for a fresh start after the end of a tumultuous relationship, and the stories of the haunted house intrigued him. He was skeptical of ghost stories, believing them to be nothing more than exaggerated tales designed to frighten children. But there was something about the house that piqued his curiosity. It was a chilly autumn evening when Adam decided to explore the house. The air was thick with fog, and the trees stood like silent sentinels, their branches swaying with the whisper of the wind. As he approached the house, the sense of dread that had always surrounded it seemed to grow stronger. The house loomed in the distance, its silhouette barely visible through the mist. Adam hesitated for a moment, but his desire to uncover the truth outweighed his fear. He stepped onto the overgrown path that led to the front door, the crunch of leaves beneath his boots the only sound in the otherwise oppressive silence. When he reached the door, it opened with a groan, as if the house itself was exhaling after being locked away for so long. Adam's heart pounded in his chest as he stepped inside, the smell of mildew and rotting wood immediately filling his nostrils. The interior of the house was just as dilapidated as the exterior. Furniture covered in dust, broken picture frames scattered across the floor, and curtains that hung like tattered ghosts in the windows. Despite the decay, there was something unsettlingly familiar about the place, as though it had once been a home filled with warmth and life. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, and Adam could feel the hairs on the back of his neck rise as he moved deeper into the house. As he walked through the narrow hallway, the floorboards creaked beneath his weight, and that's when he heard it, the sound of faint crying, barely audible but unmistakable. It sounded like a child, a soft wail that seemed to drift through the walls. Adam's breath caught in his throat, and he paused, trying to convince himself that it was just the wind, the house settling, anything but what it seemed. But then he heard it again, closer this time. The sobs echoed through the empty rooms, a mournful sound that sent a chill running down his spine. He followed the sound, his steps slow and hesitant, until he reached the living room. The crying was louder now, and as he stepped into the room, he noticed something strange. The air grew colder, and a heavy, oppressive silence filled the space, as if the house were holding its breath. Adam's eyes scanned the room, his gaze falling on the fireplace. There, in the corner, he saw something, just a shadow at first, but then it became clearer. A small figure, hunched over and trembling, sat by the hearth. It was a woman, her back to him, her dark hair hanging in long, matted strands. She was rocking back and forth, her body jerking with the sobs that filled the room. "Hello!" Adam called out cautiously, his voice shaking. The woman didn't respond. She continued to rock back and forth, her sobs growing louder and more frantic. With every step he took closer, Adam's heart seemed to pound harder in his chest. He could feel the temperature in the room drop, the chill seeping into his bones. As he reached out to touch her shoulder, she suddenly stopped rocking. The room fell deathly silent, and Adam's breath hitched in his throat as the woman slowly turned around. Her face was pale, almost ghostly, and her eyes were wide with terror, her pupils dilated. She stared at Adam with an expression of pure, unrelenting fear, as though she had seen something unspeakable. But what sent a shock of terror through Adam was the fact that her mouth was sewn shut, crude stitches pulling her lips together, sealing them in an eternal silence. Before Adam could react, the woman's form began to dissolve into mist, vanishing into the air like smoke. The temperature in the room plummeted even further, and Adam felt a rush of cold air sweep past him, the sound of soft footsteps echoing behind him. Turning quickly, he saw a shadow standing in the doorway, tall and looming, its form indistinct but undeniably human. The figure moved slowly toward him, its steps deliberate and heavy, the sound of its feet dragging across the floor like a long-forgotten ritual. Adam's heart raced as the figure neared, its presence cold and suffocating. "Who are you?" Adam whispered, his voice barely a breath. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it raised a hand, its fingers long and skeletal, pointing toward the staircase. As Adam's gaze followed the direction of the finger, he saw something that made his blood run cold. At the top of the stairs stood a child, a little girl, staring down at him with empty, hollow eyes. The figure slowly faded into the darkness, leaving Adam alone with the chilling vision of the girl. He didn't need any more warning. Fear surged through him, and he turned and fled from the house, stumbling over the broken floorboards as he ran toward the door. The fog outside had thickened, and as Adam burst into the open air, he could still hear the faint sound of footsteps following him, dragging across the floor, closer and closer. When he reached the town, he could hardly catch his breath. He had seen the house in the hollow for what it truly was, a place haunted by the souls of the past, trapped in a cycle of eternal torment. The child's crying, the woman's stitched mouth, the dragging footsteps, they were not just stories. They were real, and Adam had witnessed them. The house in the hollow still stands, waiting for the next curious soul to wander too close. And every night, as the fog rolls in and the wind howls through the trees, the sound of footsteps can still be heard, echoing through the darkness. The house is not forgotten, and neither will those who have dared to enter. The Forgotten Path. In the dense woods of New England, there exists a path that has been whispered about for generations. A path so forgotten that even the oldest locals refuse to speak of it. Some say it was once a well-trodden trail, a shortcut for those who lived on the outskirts of the town. But over time, the woods grew thicker, and the path slowly vanished, swallowed by the forest. Now, only a few brave souls dare to venture close to its entrance, where the trees seem to loom darker and the air heavier. For as long as anyone can remember, there have been rumors about the path. Whispers tell of strange happenings. People who ventured onto the forgotten trail never returned, or worse, came back changed. There's a sense that the path has a will of its own, luring those who wander into its depths and trapping them in an endless maze, never to find the way out. The locals call it the Lost Path, and they warn anyone who will listen, don't go near it. It was on a cold autumn evening when Sarah, a young woman new to the area, heard the story for the first time. She had recently moved to the small town of Morningside, looking for peace after the loss of her parents in a tragic car accident. The town was quiet, almost eerily so, but it was the kind of solitude she had been craving. She spent her days walking the wooded outskirts, trying to escape her memories, and it was on one of these walks that she first encountered an elderly man sitting at the edge of the forest. His name was Mr. Hollis, and he had lived in Morningside all his life. His face was lined with age, and his eyes held a certain knowing that unsettled Sarah. As they spoke, He warned her of the lost path. "It's not a path you should walk down," Mr. Hollis had said, his voice low and gravelly. "It's not just the forest that gets to you. There's something else, something that's been there long before any of us." Sarah had dismissed his warnings as the ramblings of an old man, though a part of her couldn't shake the unease that lingered after their conversation. Still, she continued to walk through the woods, finding comfort in the quiet and the rustling of the leaves beneath her feet. One evening, as twilight descended and the moon began to rise, Sarah found herself wandering deeper into the forest than she ever had before. She didn't know why she kept going. Perhaps it was a longing for something more, something different. She had always been drawn to the unknown. As she walked, she stumbled upon an old, weathered sign partially obscured by vines. It read, "The Lost Path." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She had heard the rumors, of course, but she had never believed them. This was just a trail, she told herself, just another way through the woods. Without thinking, she stepped onto the path. The moment her foot touched the earth, the atmosphere changed. The air grew colder, and the usual sounds of the forest, the chirping of birds, the rustling of animals, seemed to fade into silence. The trees loomed taller, their twisted branches creating a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. It was as if the world outside the path no longer existed. Sarah tried to turn back, but the path seemed to stretch endlessly in front of her, like a serpent winding through the trees. No matter how much she walked, the entrance was nowhere to be seen. Panic began to set in as she realized she was lost. As the night deepened, the silence grew heavier, and Sarah could feel eyes on her, watching, waiting. The shadows around her seemed to move, flickering in the corner of her vision. She spun around, but nothing was there. She quickened her pace, but the path seemed to shift beneath her feet. It was as if the forest itself was changing, rearranging, twisting in on itself. Sarah could feel the weight of something ancient, something malevolent, pressing down on her. Suddenly, the air grew thick with an oppressive energy, and she heard a soft voice, whispering, calling her name. The sound was distant at first, like the wind itself, but it grew louder, more insistent. "Sarah?" She froze, her breath caught in her throat. The voice was not human, not quite. It was a soft, sibilant hiss that made her skin crawl. She spun around, but there was no one there. The path seemed to stretch on endlessly, and yet it felt as if the forest was closing in on her. The whispering grew louder. "Sarah!" Panic surged through her, and she ran. She didn't know where she was going, but she had to escape. The path twisted and turned, leading her deeper into the heart of the forest, away from everything familiar. And then, suddenly, the path opened up into a clearing. It was eerily still, the air thick and heavy with a sense of wrongness. In the center of the clearing stood a large, twisted tree, its bark blackened, its branches gnarled and reaching like skeletal fingers. It felt alive, watching her, and Sarah could swear she saw something moving in its shadows. The whispering stopped, and in the silence, Sarah heard something else, footsteps. She turned sharply, her breath shallow and rapid, and saw a figure standing at the edge of the clearing. A tall man, dressed in dark clothes, his face hidden in the shadows of his hood. "Who are you?" Sarah cried, her voice trembling. The figure didn't answer. Instead, he stepped closer, and with each step, the ground beneath Sarah's feet seemed to give way. The trees around her groaned, as if the forest itself was alive, reaching out to pull her in. She tried to move, but her feet were frozen, as though the earth had claimed her. The man reached out a hand, his fingers long and pale, like the branches of the twisted tree. He touched her shoulder, and a jolt of cold shot through her body, freezing her in place. "Don't be afraid," he said, his voice deep and hollow. "You're home now." In that moment, Sarah realized that she was no longer in the world she knew. The lost path had claimed her, just as it had claimed countless others before her. There would be no escape. The last thing Sarah saw was the tree, its dark branches twisting and writhing as if alive, and the pale, haunting figure of the man stepping toward her, his face finally emerging from the shadows. His eyes were hollow, empty, and Sarah understood, with a chilling certainty, that she had become another lost soul in the forest, bound forever to the path. The whispers never stopped. They continued to call her name, just as they had called the others. And somewhere in the darkness of the woods, a new traveler would soon stumble upon the lost path, unaware of the horrors waiting for them at its end. The Guardian of Hollow Woods. In the remote town of Westbrook, nestled between the ancient and mist-shrouded Hollow Woods, there was a legend that the townspeople would rarely speak of for fear of invoking it. The legend told of a man, an old forest keeper named Thaddeus Ward, who had died years ago, but whose spirit still roamed the woods, forever bound to the trees he had sworn to protect. Thaddeus had been the keeper of Hollow Woods for most of his life. A quiet, solitary man, he had known the woods like no other. It was said that he could communicate with the forest, feeling the pulse of the earth beneath his feet, listening to the whispers of the leaves in the wind, and understanding the moods of the creatures that called the forest home. He had devoted his life to protecting the forest from those who would harm it, whether it was poachers, vandals, or those who came to take from it without giving back. But one fateful night, a group of trespassers arrived, armed with axes and saws, intent on cutting down the ancient trees that had stood for centuries. They had no respect for the sacredness of the forest, and they believed that the trees were nothing more than resources to be exploited. Thaddeus, who had always stood as a guardian, confronted them in the dead of night. What happened next remained a mystery. Some say he fought them off. Others say he was overpowered and killed. His body was found in the woods, surrounded by the wreckage of his life's work. But there was no sign of struggle, no blood, no trace of his killers. Only the feeling of an unnatural stillness in the air. Despite his death, the people of Westbrook knew that Thaddeus was not truly gone. They said his spirit had lingered, bound to the woods he had loved. And ever since, those who dared to enter the forest at night could feel the presence of something watching. One such night, a young man named Ethan had returned to Westbrook after years of living in the city. He had heard the stories about the forest, but he was skeptical. He believed in logic and science, not in ghosts and legends. He had come back to visit his old home, looking for closure after the passing of his father. And after hearing tales of the Guardian of Hollow Woods, he decided to explore the forest for himself. Ethan set out on a crisp autumn evening, the full moon hanging high in the sky. The trees of Hollow Woods seemed to lean in on him as he walked, their branches bare and twisting like skeletal hands. He could hear the rustling of leaves beneath his feet and the occasional hoot of an owl high in the trees. But despite the beauty of the forest, something felt wrong. There was an oppressive weight in the air, a sense of foreboding that gnawed at the back of his mind. As he ventured deeper into the woods, the sounds of the night seemed to fade, leaving only silence. Ethan pushed on, telling himself that the legends were just stories, that there was no reason to be afraid. But then he saw it. Just ahead, a figure standing motionless among the trees. It was a tall man, cloaked in shadows, his face hidden in the darkness of his hood. The figure didn't move, but Ethan could feel the eyes on him, cold and penetrating. "Who's there?" Ethan called out, his voice trembling slightly, though he tried to keep it steady. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it began to move, gliding silently through the trees. Ethan's heart raced, and he instinctively took a step back, feeling the air grow colder with every passing second. The figure seemed to be beckoning him, leading him deeper into the forest. Ethan hesitated. Something inside him screamed to turn back, but his curiosity pushed him forward. He had to know who or what this was. So, against his better judgment, he followed the figure. The forest around him seemed to shift as he walked. The trees twisted in strange, unnatural shapes, their limbs reaching out like grasping hands. The path beneath his feet grew uneven, and the moonlight seemed to be swallowed by the thick canopy above. The deeper he went, the darker it became, and soon, he could no longer tell which direction he had come from. Suddenly, the figure stopped in a clearing. Ethan found himself in a place he didn't recognize, a dark, silent hollow, where the trees seemed to grow taller and thicker, their bark blackened and gnarled. In the center of the clearing stood a massive stone altar, covered in moss and vines, the remnants of some ancient ritual. The figure turned to face Ethan, and for the first time, he saw its face, pale and drawn, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare into his very soul. It was Thaddeus Ward, the old forest keeper, or at least something that resembled him. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Instead, Ethan heard a voice, deep, resonant, and cold, coming from all directions at once. "You trespass in my domain," the voice intoned, as though it were the forest itself speaking through Thaddeus' form. "The woods have a price, and you will pay it." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as the air around him grew colder still. He tried to speak, to apologize, to explain that he didn't believe in the legends. But the words caught in his throat, his voice choked by an unseen force. Suddenly, the ground beneath his feet began to tremble, and the trees around him groaned as if awakening from a long slumber. The stone altar cracked, and from the earth rose twisted roots and vines, wrapping around Ethan's ankles, pulling him toward the center of the clearing. "Please!" Ethan shouted, panic flooding his voice. "I didn't mean any harm. The figure of Thaddeus stepped closer, its hollow eyes locking onto Ethan's. "The forest is not for you to understand. The forest has its guardians, and I am its keeper. You have disturbed the balance, and now you must face the consequences." With a violent jolt, Ethan was thrown to the ground. The vines released him, and the figure of Thaddeus stood over him, casting a long, unnatural shadow. "Leave this place," the voice commanded. "Leave and never return." Ethan scrambled to his feet, his body trembling with fear. He didn't need any more warning. He turned and fled, the forest seemingly alive and moving around him, as if it, too, was trying to push him out. He ran blindly through the woods, the sound of footsteps echoing in his ears. But when he looked back, the figure of Thaddeus was gone. The forest had returned to its usual stillness, and the oppressive air had lifted. By the time he reached the edge of the woods, the sun had just begun to rise. Ethan was exhausted, drenched in sweat, and his heart was still racing. He looked back one last time at the dark tree line of hollow woods, feeling the weight of what had happened settle in his chest. He had encountered something not of this world, something ancient and powerful. The people of Westbrook had been right all along. The guardian of hollow woods was real, and Thaddeus Ward's spirit still walked the forest, watching, waiting for those who would dare to harm it. Ethan never spoke of his experience to anyone, but he knew one thing for sure. He would never again set foot in those woods.